Prosecco is everywhere these days. You can find it at fancy restaurants, music festivals, wedding receptions, and garden parties. It has a clear identity and it's affordable, so people from all walks of life drink it. However, there are a few wines that are as often misunderstood, and I've heard too many false statements about this wine. So in this video, I'm going to go through the 10 most common mistakes to get to the truth about Prosecco. Let's go. I recently went back to Prosecco's homeland, visited wineries and talked to many winemakers. Even though Prosecco's history is fairly short, it's full of successes, but it's still not fully understood by many wine drinkers. So with the help of Prosecco DOC, who've supported this video, I'm going to go through the most common misunderstandings. They're here on those cards. I will go through them one by one. So let's spill some truths instead of spilling wine for a change. So the first common misunderstanding is Prosecco is a wine star. Prosecco's success also means that it's often used by people as a name for a category, a bit like the brand Post-its is often used as the name for all types of sticky notes. Prosecco is often used as the term for all kinds of sparkling wines that are more fruit-driven, even though many of those wines have nothing to do with the original. Prosecco's problem in this regard is that its name sounds similar to the Italian word for dry, secco. So there are many wines in the market nowadays that have secco somewhere in their name. They are not Prosecco though. The name Prosecco comes from a little village near the town of Trieste. This is a beautiful area that I just recently visited, and it likely doesn't have anything to do with secco. It comes from the Slavic word prosek, which means a cut down forest or an opening in a forest. The village gave its name to the DOC, the Denominazione d'Origine Controllata, the controlled designation of origin. Prosecco DOC consists of two regions in the northeast of Italy, Veneto and Friuli Venezia Giulia. It covers roughly 28,000 hectares of vineyards, and around about 12,000 vintners work the land here. Only wine from that DOC, from that region, can actually be called Prosecco, even if there are other wines with secco in their name. You can identify real Prosecco by the following attributes: the seal of the DOC, the QR code that should be on every bottle somewhere, and the terms Prosecco DOC and Italy on the label. So next up we have number 2, Prosecco is a grape variety. Well, Prosecco is not a grape variety, at least it isn't today. In the early days of the region's history, the main grape variety that was used for the production of Prosecco was also called Prosecco. There were other grape varieties involved, but this one was the main single varietal, and it wasn't really planted anywhere else in sufficient amounts outside of the region. As Prosecco's wines became more successful, other regions also wanted to participate in this success and started planting the same varietal. This represented a threat to the region's identity, as you cannot really protect the name of a grape variety, and other wineries could just put Prosecco on the label if they used the same varietal. This changed with the introduction of the Prosecco DOC in 2009. The name that refers to that village in that region and that was mentioned many times in the historic literature became the name of the new DOC. As you know, many grape varieties have different names, and one of those synonyms became the official name of the main grape variety in the DOC Prosecco, and it was Glera. Since then, not all countries have stopped using the protected term Prosecco to describe their wines made from the grape variety Glera, but overall this move really has helped the region to establish and protect their identity. Apart from the main grape variety Glera, other grape varieties can also be used in the production of Prosecco. They include Verdiso, Bianchetta Trevignana, Pereira, Glera Lunga, and the international grape varieties Chardonnay and Pinot, but most Proseccos are 100% Glera. Wow, I'm definitely spilling some facts here. If you want to learn more about wine, you should check out Cellar Class, my new independent education platform. The link is in the description, and have a look at Cellar Class to make your world taste better. So next up we have number 3, Prosecco is always white. That is not true. But it was true for most of Prosecco's history. It was a white wine, but then the interest in rosé wines in general and in Prosecco Rosé in particular increased, so the DOC started experimenting and researching, and in 2020 they finally released Prosecco DOC Rosé. The wine has to be a blend of Glera and Pinot Nero or Pinot Noir, as Pinot Noir was already allowed for the production of white Prosecco, is a grape variety that is fairly successful in northern Italy overall, and is a grape variety that is very commonly used for the production of sparkling wines. It was a natural fit. Wineries can blend in between 10 and 15% of Pinot Nero vinified as a red wine in order to make their Prosecco Rosé. It always has to be a vintage wine, and the first vintage ever released was 2019. So let's move on to the next common misperception, and that is you can add CO2 to Prosecco. I've heard that mistake from many people, sommeliers, and also people I would consider wine experts. But that is just not true. This understanding might have something to do with other wines that have similar names and are made by just adding CO2 to a still wine, kind of like what you would do at home when you want to turn your tap water into sparkling water. Prosecco wines cannot, I repeat, be made by just injecting CO2 into a wine. Instead, most of them, the vast majority, is made following the Martinotti method that was first developed in Italy, but is also known under the name Charmat method internationally. This method involves 2 fermentations. So first you make a still base wine, then you add sugar and yeast to that still base wine and introduce a second fermentation that takes place in a pressure tank. The process is kind of like the traditional method that is used for many other sparkling wines, with the admittedly big difference that one takes place in bottle, whereas the other takes place in a pressure tank. Oftentimes this tank method is regarded as the lesser option when it comes to producing quality, and while it is true that many wines made using the traditional method are usually more expensive, it is not so much a question of quality and more a question of style that differentiates the 2 methods. The tank method is easier to control and doesn't expose the wine as much to the dead yeast cells, the so-called lees. The wine therefore tastes more fruit-driven and doesn't have those aromas of brioche and bread crust. The fruit flavor and the easy accessibility of the wine are important factors when it comes to the success of Prosecco. Most consumers want their wines to taste fruity and not yeasty. The exception when it comes to Prosecco DOC and the Martinotti method is this Prosecco col fondo. It is fermented in bottle. It comes to the market bottled under a crown cap, and you can usually see the lees here. So there's quite a lot of lees here as the wine is unfiltered. It usually tastes very different to normal Prosecco DOC. It is yeastier, it's a little bit wilder, and usually very dry and fresh. So next up we have number 5, Prosecco is always sweet. Prosecco is not sweet. It might be sweeter than some other classical sparkling wine styles, but 94% of all Prosecco is between Brut Nature and extra dry, meaning that it contains less than 18 grams per liter of residual sugar. 2/3 of the production is extra dry, which means it contains between 12 and 17 grams per liter of residual sugar. And the category of Brut Prosecco has increased in recent years, meaning that there are quite a few fairly dry Proseccos around containing between 0 and 12 grams of residual sugar. But I think actually the slight fruitiness, the richer concentration on the palate is one of the reasons why Prosecco has been so successful. But if you prefer a drier style, you can always look for Brut or even Brut Nature Prosecco. On we go to number 6. Prosecco is always frizzante. This might be a little confusing for some of you who only think in 2 categories, still and sparkling wines. But most legislations actually differentiate between semi-sparkling wines, which the Italians call frizzante, and sparkling wines, which they call spumante. Frizzante wines by law have to have between 1 and 2.5 bar pressure, while spumante wines have to have more than 3 bar pressure, so a little bit more than what your car tire should have. Here in Germany, there's a big difference between semi-sparkling and sparkling wines when it comes to taxes, and frizzante wines tend to be a lot cheaper. In Prosecco, however, frizzante wines don't play a big role. 15% of the total production is frizzante, whereas the rest is spumante. So next we have number 7. Prosecco can be sold in cans or kegs. You might remember a time when you saw Paris Hilton everywhere drinking Prosecco from a golden can. Her rich Prosecco was a commercial success, but it didn't represent what the region wanted for its wines. So with the introduction of the DOC in 2009, it became law that Prosecco always has to be bottled in a glass bottle and sealed under a cork stopper. However, this doesn't stop Paris from selling her rich products under the term Secco, but as I mentioned before, this is not Prosecco. The same is true for wines that are sold on tap from kegs. Sometimes restaurants might advertise this as a Prosecco, but again, this cannot be Prosecco. The Prosecco DOC Consortium recently released a campaign under the title "This is not Prosecco" in the UK, where there seems to be a lot of confusion surrounding this topic. They posted posters in the London Underground informing passengers that Prosecco is never sold on tap. So next up we have number 8. Every Prosecco tastes more or less the same. In a blind tasting, Prosecco is a wine style that is fairly easy to identify because it has a clear identity. But if you go to the region, you can actually taste many different expressions of Prosecco coming out of different wineries. On top of that, there are significant differences in terroir, for example, between the plains that are very much influenced by the Mediterranean Sea and the vineyards in the mountains that are really close to the Dolomites and have more of a mountain character. There are specific designations for the vineyards surrounding the cities of Trieste and Treviso, and on top of that, there are very different viticultural practices. Some vineyards are planted as pergola, some are planted as Bellucera, and some are planted as Guyot, for example. There are the different categories of white, rosé, and col fondo, and you can also find many different dosage levels, giving you quite a lot of diversity in that region. So on we go to number 9. Prosecco always has to be sparkling. There is actually still Prosecco coming out of Prosecco DOC. It is a rarity. There isn't a lot of it. I think the official number is 0.1% of the total production, and most of it really stays in the region for regional consumption, so you might not be able to find any in your market. I've tasted some. They tend to be light, refreshing, low in alcohol. They are not serious wines, but they can be kind of lively and delicious. So last but not least, number 10. Prosecco can only be enjoyed as an aperitif. Many people think Prosecco can't be paired with food. Think again. I've experimented a lot with Prosecco and food, and I have to tell you, it is a very food-friendly wine, but let me show you. Still the best sound in the world. So here I have a Prosecco Rosé, kind of pale rosé in color. And this is the more standard white Prosecco. And I have a few dishes that will work with those two wines. So first of all, I have a burrata, which is kind of coming apart a little bit, but it's still delicious. A creamy mozzarella-like cheese, which is absolutely delicious with something fruity and acidic. I have some pasta here with cream sauce and parmesan on top, which for me is a beautiful match. I have a little prawn cocktail here, which should be quite nice with the rosé. I have some sushi here and some creamy sauce with herring. That's a more German kind of speciality. When it comes to matching Prosecco and food, the same rules apply like with other food. You don't want to overpower the wine with the food, so you don't really want to serve braised meat, for example, with the Prosecco, that usually doesn't work. But what works really well is creamy stuff that hasn't extremely intense flavors and the fresh and lively acidity of the Prosecco. So here we have the burrata, which is creamy and beautifully textured. And if you have a sip of Prosecco with this, it livens up the cheese flavor and brings it out even more clearly. The same is true when it comes to pasta and cream sauces. So this obviously doesn't have a lot of flavor, but a lot of texture. And by breaking up that creamy, greasy texture, you make the whole meal even more enjoyable. The big differences when it comes to pairing other sparkling wines with food and pairing Prosecco with food is that Prosecco usually has more fruit flavor and has a little bit more sweetness, as many of them are extra dry. So it actually has a little bit more power and can deal with slightly more intense dishes and gives the dish a little bit more fruitiness, which can be absolutely beautiful. So let's move on to the Rosé, which tends to have a little bit more power. On top of that, you also have a little bit of strawberry notes coming through. So all in all, it's a bit of a richer Prosecco style in general. And for that, I would go with something that is also a little bit more intense in flavor, the prawn cocktail. The Prosecco breaks up the fat and makes the meal just a little bit more lively and delicious. And when it comes to more aromatic sushi, this rule also applies. Due to its low alcohol and juicy texture, it's actually also a good match with slightly spicy meals like this slightly spicy sushi. So when it comes to the herring in dill cream sauce, I would actually stick with the Prosecco Rosé. This is a really intense salty dish, if you can call it a dish. And the juiciness of the Rosé Prosecco actually, just makes this a little bit more complete. All right, I think I debunked quite a lot of misunderstandings when it comes to Prosecco. If you have some more for me, then put them in the comments. Also give me your thoughts on Prosecco, but whatever you do, stay thirsty.